This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us tonight Dr. Buck Melton. Welcome, Buck.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I'm going to tonight. Let's pretend that you've got a chance to become president, and I'm going to be the inquisitor, and I'll ask the question about what you see as America's role in the 21st century as a general springboard for your presidential aspirations. What would you tell the American people? What's their fate in the 21st century? What's going to happen with our country in this century?
A chicken in every pot, a car in every garage. Our best days are ahead of us, and if you believe that one, I'll tell you another.
Just be sure you're going to give everyone a lot of money, and whatever happens, ittle be great because you're their friend.
Yes,
is that
that's
correct?
Right.
Okay, now
yes.
I think you're of presidential timber right there.
Thank you.
Well, actually, we've had a little moment of levity there, but maybe we can discuss some of what's up with our country in the 21st century. It obviously had a tremendous 20th century. If you consider what happened, the population quadrupled, the national wealth quadrupled. By ourselves, we won World War, well, with a little help with our friends, I would say. We won World War I, we won World War II. We defeated the.
I don't think you better let the Russians hear that one.
Well, I'll throw that out. We defeated all the bad guys, and we also we destroyed communism. So what a century for our country.
There's a reason it's called the American century.
We really did it, and the economic welfare of the people just as extraordinary. A lot of the problems, the social problems we have in the country, at least we're trying to pay attention to it. We're trying to make life better for everyone so that the country is innovative. It went to the moon. It's just a litany of things the U.S. has accomplished in the 20th century. And the question to ask is, can this be repeated in the 21st century? And we're well into the 21st century. Do we have the same national id to do this kind of thing, or has our day passed?
I'm afraid that our day has passed. I'm afraid that I do not have a very sanguine view of things, and I can list for you the major elements that I see that will be lacking. I don't know if anything can be done about them, and if anything can be done, I don't know if we have the political will to do it or the national will to do it. So I'm afraid I've got a pretty grim view of things.
Well, why don't you be a little more specific about that, if you would, Bucky? What are some things that you think are taking the country down, and what are the problems we have now?
I think probably the two big keys to our greatness in the 20th century were cheap energy and good solid currency. And we've long since done away with, murdered the gold standard, and the energy crisis showed that we've got a real problem in the energy department. We've got the what used to be called the third world, although I don't hear that phrase a lot anymore. The developing world, I guess.
That's what you hear.
Yes, which is going to give us a real run for our money in terms of energy demands. If you look at India, if you look at China, they're going to be bidding for the oil that we desperately need, and the American dollar is not quite as respected as it used to be. I think an early canary in the coal mine was it Standard & Poor's about 4 years ago downgraded us from AAA to AA+. And that's a small downgrade, but I think it's a bellwether. And then on top of all this, and I think I would lump this in with the money situation, the fact of our $20 trillion national debt that no one in Washington is talking about, that continues to increase at a mind-boggling rate, and that no one seems inclined to do anything about except sweep under the rug. That is a time bomb that's waiting to explode. Well,
those are two problems. I can name some more, but I would I think, to use a word you use, sanguine, I wonder about our energy situation. It appears to me that this extraordinary revolution has taken place with American ingenuity, with fracking, getting these horizontal drilling in the shale, and then pumping water in, and so huge amounts of natural gas and petroleum are being generated. And so in some ways I can recollect in my younger days hearing about the energy crisis. We're dependent on foreign oil, how bad that is. The country is at risk to Middle Eastern potentates and sheiks that might at any moment destroy the country. We had the oil embargo of 1974, which just about took the country down. There's a huge transference of wealth to the oil-producing countries, and voila, American ingenuity has really lowered the energy prices enormously, and actually smashed, in some ways, OPEC has been smashed. And all those people that have been extracting wealth from us have been diminished. I think that's a fair statement. Additionally, there are all kinds of secondary sources of energy that are being developed, which are not dependent on petroleum products. Those are all things that I think are good in that subject. So I'm inclined to think, well, this is a good example of what the country can do. And I'll move to your second point, which is to me a little more worrisome, and that's the economic underpinnings of the country and the national debt. And it does appear that the politicians are just passing benefits to their constituents, the way that Aristotle spoke about the major dangers to democracy would be tyrants. So he thought there was an evolution of governmental structure, and the last sort of way on the road to hell would be to have a democratic system, and then inevitably the democratic system would produce a tyrant who would then use the power of the state to pass along goodies to the voters, to his constituency, and then he would become just a perpetual dictator. So it's a little bit of a danger that the country has such an enormous national debt, and the debt is increasing in many ways, secondary to income transference. So the government is just lowering taxes. They're exempting people from paying taxes. Over 50% of the people in the United States don't pay any income tax. That's bad in many ways, besides the government's need for the money. The other thing is a sense of unity in the population. So if you're not paying taxes, in many countries you wouldn't really be part of the national
you don't have a state
community.
Yes.
Well, I mean, traditionally those are the people that were excluded from voting because they didn't have a role in the state and would only extract benefit without I guess feeling responsibility for the welfare of the country. Well, I think that's a fair concern with the enormous national debt and the way that Washington is spending money. But I think the counter argument against that is that it's a percentage of the gross national product. So, okay, we can have this number, the number can be a big one, just as long as the gross national product increases enough so the percentage is kept manageable. I don't believe that's happening. It's not happening.
It's actually, if you look at the figures, it's worrisome, that proportion. The debt has now exceeded the GDP, and I believe it continues to widen the gap.
And I think the death, I mean, if you think of this as like a sort of a thermometer, and it's if you have a terminal disease, if your temp is over 106 Fahrenheit, whatever, I think if the ratio goes to over 2, that's what destroys the place. And a good example would be Greece. So their national debt just became so unsustainable it knocked the country off. Another example closer to home would be Puerto Rico, which they have this tremendous debt that's not sustainable, and so there's going to be some kind of default. So there's a financial potential crisis that's going to worry us in this century. But I'll make this comment. We have to think about our competitors in the world and how they're doing. And sort of the story would be, to extend the analogy a little bit, the Roman Empire. What happened to the Roman Empire? Why were they knocked off? And in many ways, they had their own weaknesses, but their competitors, the barbarians on the other side of the Rhine, they were getting better and better and better, and Rome was sort of flatlining it. And because their rivals got so much better, they overwhelmed them. Well, I think as we look at our fate in the 21st century, we have to consider rival civilizations, if one wishes to use that word, and the problems they do or don't face. So we could continue to be the dominant power in the world, and our viewpoints would be number one, if our competitors had substantial difficulties. And contrary-wise, if they're doing much better than we would be doing, then our influence would correspondingly drop. So I think it's a pretty ubiquitous problem. The debts everywhere in the world are going up, particularly in a place like China, and they may pop before we pop. It's a worldwide issue with debt. It's not just us, it's everywhere.
Well, that's certainly a possibility, but I get the impression, and you are certainly more knowledgeable about this than I, that the long-range planning and the centrality of the planning that the Chinese have, I think give them a tremendous edge over the United States, and that they're going to be a much tougher competition than we have probably ever seen before, or at least since we've been an industrialized country. What would you say to that?
Well, that's right. So one of the things that we need,
even with their debt,
right? If we consider the 20th century, one reason the country had such a great century was that we had a lot of particular advantages. Among them, a huge national market. All the advances that were taking place anywhere in the world had immediate access to us. So if the Brits had some great idea on any particular product, we could get it right away. We could put railroads were developed in England. We could immediately put railroads here. Steamboats, we could do the same thing. Any kind of advance was immediately transposed to our country, and there were no barriers to getting it there. So that gave us enormous advantages. Well, when we look at the Chinese, a similar kind of thing is taking place. I think almost all of the products the West produces, particularly the U.S., all the intellectual property is fair game for the Chinese government and entrepreneurs. So the patent arrangements don't protect U.S. products in China.
They have no interest at all in the IP protection.
So that's right. So they immediately have access to anything we have, and they just rejig it for their own purposes. Another advantage the Chinese have is they have 1.4 billion people. They have over four times our population. And they're integrating that huge number of people into the commercial system. And they're obviously going to find geniuses there. They're going to find people that are going to make great intellectual progress. And we're going to have a real issue with, in my opinion, China is for a rival for the dominant force on the planet. I'm less concerned about the Russians. Their geopolitical situation is very fragile. It's very fragile. Their population is less than half of ours. They have all kinds of geopolitical issues. They depend so much on petroleum. They have just one major export. They have lots and lots of issues. And I think just maintaining their national identity and governing the great part of the world they govern is just, their plate is full.
Yes.
The Chinese, on the other hand, have real aspirations and to really reestablish their hegemony over the world as they see it, the Middle Kingdom, and they certainly have many possibilities of obtaining that. I would ask you this question back, Bucky. If you think the Chinese are going to be our number one rivals for world hegemony in the 21st century, what is it that we should do in relationships with Chinese? What should we do? What should be the U.S. relationship?
You've got me there. I don't know. Our economic systems, we have a weird sort of symbiotic system. They need us. They need us as a consumer for their products, and we need them to provide that. So in some sense, we have a bit of a partnership. But this debt that they continue to buy really bothers me, especially if they are forcing some sort of geostrategic confrontation, which they are giving tremendous indications that they are interested in doing, both in East Asia and in the Western Pacific. So I'm not really sure where that ends. Are we friends? I don't think so. Are we enemies? that's probably too strong a word. Friendly enemies? I just don't know how this plays out economically, militarily. I am worried that we seem internally more and more divided at all times, and that we have what Carter, of course, referred to as the national malaise in one of his speeches.
That's not a good thing for a politician to say. Is that correct? Don't say, Bucky, if you're
didn't
trying to
well,
get in the White House, don't say that. No,
national malaise has overtaken
don't
the
mention
American
that.
people, so yes.
It's Morning in America. Well, I think that might be a good one.
Good try.
Yes, right.
But yes, we seem to be pulling apart. I think a lot of this is due to the internet as people find their own comfortable echo chambers. I think it's interesting in the Western world that you're starting to see secessionist movements. Brexit, Scottish national movement, California, some people in California talking secession.
Really?
Not many yet, but when you consider what I've seen in my lifetime, that in the century or so after the Civil War, anyone talking seriously about secession would have been laughed off the college faculty. There are not a lot of people talking seriously about it yet, but there are what I'd like to say serious whispers. 40 years ago, this would have been unthinkable. As people find once again, their own cultures, and sometimes these are just virtual cultures, but it's dividing us, this idea of diversity. So we are dividing in the face of a culture and a civilization that seems to be tremendously bent on uniting itself and presenting a united front to the world, which is China.
Yes, we can compare the two countries in many ways. In the 21st century, they've got, each country has its advantages. And the big deal, in my opinion, is just collaboration. I mean, it'd be a terrible mistake for our species that we just can't have any substantial world conflicts because of the awful weapons that our species possesses. We have to enter some kind of new think session about how we handle the world. We can't have any nuclear exchanges. We can't have biological warfare. We can't use poison gas. We have to just work things out at the conference table. And in my opinion, the idea is it would be a great thing for the country and its national accomplishments if it led the world into some kind of peaceful uplands, if possible. That would be a great thing.
Thank you, Mr. Churchill.
That would be a great thing to do if we could do it. And that's going to take a lot of effort. And one of the things that disturbs that, as I think you correctly brought this up, is the way that our national identity has been altered for the worse. I think many people have made comments about that. So if you go through the sort of evolution of the national identity, to start with, pretty much people were English Protestants here, or from the British Isle, they were Protestants. And then gradually the things widened to Europeans, just general European, Protestant Europeans, then Catholic Europeans, then anyone of European descent. Then after that, anyone from anywhere that could come here, from any place of any national origin. And then the idea is we would have some kind of enormous melting pot. And central to that melting pot would be the idea that we all speak English and that we all subscribe to sort of a national religion, and the country is going to act in a moral fashion, and there'll be fair treatment for everyone here. So if many people have come here, they've been on the wrong end of the social ladder, I guess you could say that. They were being, in their home countries, they were being held down by circumstances and by bad systems. And once you were in America, if you worked hard, you could be heir to the American dream, and then your children could live in this bright place and be friends and do good works and go to the moon or Mars, and that would be the idea. And the problem, I think, is that maintaining that melting pot national religion identity is becoming more and more difficult for lots of reasons. And the centrifugal forces are being encouraged by so much.
Yes.
The idea is that I think taking a knee at football games, that's really a destructive thing. That's a very destructive thing. And you could say, well, that's justifiable. You could say that. I mean, I could listen to the defense of it. But as far as the national identity goes, that's a terrible thing. Also, coming to grips with our history is a complicated kind of story. If you're of an abused minority, and obviously the history, national history has been painful for you, and the idea of trying to erase the cultural experience of the country, that's a difficult thing if you try and do that, because many people are aggrieved if you attempt to do that. Also, we have the idea of languages, individual identities, and also the idea of special treatment. So if you're in a particular group, then you're going to get special treatment. The other problem that's out there, I think, is the idea that safe spaces exist where opinions are going to be suppressed that you don't agree with. So a lot of the idea, at least the Jeffersonian idea, is free interchange, and truth will suppress error.
Well, the Voltaire idea, I disagree with what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it.
So many people are saying, well, look, I don't. My history is gone. I don't have a right to express myself, and my children are going to be punished for the sins of their forefathers. And this is all under the rubric of this nation. So that's really corrosive.
Let's add one more, if I could interject here. And this is a legacy, I think, of the Vietnam era. The fact that we no longer trust our government, and have not for some years. We see the government not as an emanation of the popular will or of the people, but something set up in opposition to that. We don't trust, not only do we not trust the government, we don't trust authority. So,
well, is that because the people that have been put over us, to use that phrase, we see their moral failings on a daily basis. Yes. So any kind of moral failing that any of our political figures have, and one could make a case that to pursue a political career, it requires a certain narcissism that is occasionally irrational, and there's a lot of fraudulent talk that goes on, and people can understand that. And so they're suspicious everywhere of authority, and our political matrices is being very challenged. And restoring confidence in the government would be a big thing. How confident do you think people are with their political figures and political leaders, despite your aspirations for 2020?
Yes.
You may speak.
Well, not at all. I mean, look at the, and I have not checked them recently, but certainly over the last 10 years or so, look at public approval ratings of Congress. They're in the single digits, or they certainly have been in the single digits. And they can't seem to get anything done. There is no consensus, as there had generally been for many decades of the 20th century. There is nothing but gridlock, mutual finger pointing. I have only in a couple of times in American history have you seen the partisan rancor at the levels that it has consistently been at for the last 10 or 15 years. One was in the 1790s, when the whole idea of political parties was new and unfamiliar. And the other time was in the lead up to the Civil War, when compromise completely broke down, and the result of that was the bloodiest war in our history. And we are back to that level today, and there seemed to be no sign of it changing.
Well, you know, there are people of goodwill that are trying to make this work, so we can't forget that. The analogy I would use would be Spain in 1935, where the cultural tensions in that country were overwhelming. That in the Spanish Civil War happened in 1936, but Catalonia was very, very liberal. It was progressive, almost Marxian. There was a lot of opposition to the Catholic Church. Traditional moral viewpoints were under assault, and labor unions were powerful. And then the conservative part of the country, I'll say Andalusia in the south, the church was strong. The traditional view of society was powerfully imprinted. If those two competing sections just clashed, there was no way to have any kind of compromise. So one of the things going on now, it appears to me, is some parts of the country, I might say San Francisco, to name some areas in San Francisco, and say South Georgia. Boy, those differences are extraordinary. They're what people think is right and wrong, good and bad, it's very different. And that's a real cultural problem we have. And to really do what the country needs to do, or should do, or could do in the 21st century, a lot of there needs to be a lot of healing going on. There needs to be some substantial healers. I wonder how difficult it is for the country if it continues to take in thousands of people, millions of people into the lifeboat here. Is that we've had conversations in the past about that, the immigration numbers in the 1920s.
Yes.
So people said, well, let's restrict things. But if you look at the population of the country and the demographics of the different groups here, it's obviously, for better or worse, the traditional European heritage of the country won't be here in 2050. It'll be another kind of arrangement that are put together. And how, in that new demographic arrangement, can the country's better side appear? I guess you'd say that.
You know, it's funny you should mention that. I suppose this will be, since we're running a bit low on time, I think my summarizing comment, I just happened to be reading Lincoln's first inaugural address today. We're at the time
that's normal. That's normal. I mean, just a happen chance.
We're at the time of the semester when I try to introduce my students to that. And the final couple of paragraphs, when he says, first of all, and he's speaking to Southerners here, we are not enemies but friends. We must not be enemies. And then, of course, he speaks of the better angels of our nature. I think we need to be telling ourselves that with the divisive sub-communities that we're developing now, that we have to find that common element again and say to other Americans, whatever race, whatever nationality, whatever economic level, we are not enemies but friends. We must not be enemies. And we seem to have forgotten that. That's one of our problems right now.
Well, who says that? Let's consider that. What politician is out there saying, look, I want to be buddies with you. Let's talk about this. The civility in Washington is allegedly markedly decreased. If you look at the differences on TV channels, the viewpoints that are being espoused by competing media outlets, it's unbelievable. It's like there are two different stories out there. And the sense of, I guess I would even use the word hatred of the other side of them is so powerfully expressed there. And it's certainly against our national mission, if you wanted to say this. The city on the hill, whatever the country really could do, it's almost divine mission to be a real special place in the world, is being destroyed by this terrible political discourse. That'd be my comment about it. It really is awful, isn't it? I mean, just the level of just, I don't know, unpleasant people squealing at each other. It just doesn't seem to be a good thing for the country.
And I think that most Americans are fundamentally decent, fundamentally good people, but these most Americans are being drowned out by the extremes. And some of these extremes are in the media. Some of them are marching on the streets on one side or the other. And some of them, unfortunately, are being elected to Congress. The way the demographics and the gerrymandering has happened, you get the more extreme members, the less compromising members, getting elected. So,
well,
what do you do?
My final comment is one of the challenges the country faces is the extraordinary exponential change that's occurring. So how do it's a rocket ship going up. The change, 2 years from now, will be 25 years in the future. 5 years from now will be a century in the future.
Yes.
So understanding and responding to that change and not losing sight of our moral heritage is a really important factor, I think.
Yes.
Okay.
One hopes we can keep our eye on that.
Well, Bucky, once again, thank you for coming.
Sir.
Thank you. Thanks.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.